Well, good morning, Beezone listeners and watchers. This is Ed Reether with Terry Patten, sitting in San Anselmo, Marin County, Bay Area, California, for a preview interview for Terry Patten's new book, A New Republic of the Heart, which is due out in March of next year. So me visiting this area, I wanted to catch Terry. We've been in conversation. You've probably watched a couple of our videos. And so I would like to grab him here and talk to him about his new book, A New Republic of the Heart. So good morning, Terry.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
How are you?
I'm great.
Good,
Yeah.
good. Tell me a little bit about the origins of the New Republic.
Well, the origins of this book go way back because in a sense it's the book that I've aspired to write pretty much all my life.
Okay.
And I wrote a previous book. It wasn't none of the same content. It was a different moment, but 20 years ago I tried to tackle the biggest questions of our time with a book that never was what I wanted it to be. I couldn't do it yet. I hadn't gathered enough perspectives or deepened in my contemplation of our larger situation, and even in my practice or my ability to serve other people in their practice yet. Not as I now feel I'm able to do in this book.
There is the political solution that is going on today. There is the meditative or more ascetic approach to this spirituality, because it's not just, you don't just talk about the politics as a solution, but you bring in what is today's world of non-duality, right? Integral yoga, integral thought, bringing us into that oneness that we have awakened to in this time, in the nuclear age, in the current age of our day.
Some people have awakened.
Some people have awakened. And so we still have the Palestinians and the Israelis in their world, and then we still have people in Africa who are divided and having genocidal issues, which are barbaric by these standards, what you're spreading. As we sit in Marin County here, right?
Right.
With the affluence and the education and the level of life here, but step out, go east and go south, and you're in a whole different world.
Right.
So the conversation covers what you do, permeates all of this.
Yeah.
Right? Just beginning the conversation, or if you're in the conversation, because Terry talks about what needs to happen if we're going to survive as a species.
Well, it's hard to know exactly what the worst case looks like. Is it human extinction, or is it a sort of Mad Max dystopian degeneration and cultural regression, or is it just a kind of armed fortress eco-villages in a
Mad Max world.
A Mad Max world that has kind of the monastery strategy. There are all kinds of possibilities in terms of negative scenarios. But I think our immediate future is going to be punctuated by amazing positive disruptions, particularly technological breakthroughs that are going to really change everything.
Which you point to, because you also say that these breakthroughs are going to be difficult for one's belief systems, or the transformations that people must go through are sometimes traumatic, not emotionally, but even cataclysmic kind of things that say out of the bad comes the good, or part of the purification may be difficult for some people.
Well, it's already difficult for almost everyone. I mean, my experience teaching and talking with people is that, particularly in the United States, 2016, the election year, and then 2017, the first year of the Trump presidency, has been profoundly traumatizing to thousands and thousands of people, and mobilizing.
But you point out in that political landscape you just mentioned is that for you, the challenge was to find something beautiful in Trump.
Yes.
And could you maybe address that? Because that's generally the conversation, because we could jump to the higher levels of all this, or the different levels, but how do you find something beautiful in
Well,
Trump?
I want to answer that question, but offer a little bit of context. The conversation that we're referring to is the honest human conversation that we all can have with one another about what really matters right now. Not just in terms of the absolute, but in terms of what's happening in the moment, what's really happening. And there are so many perspectives that we can take on this, each of which imply a different bottom line. So what's really happening right now is a crisis of American democracy. What's really happening right now is an ecological crisis and predicament on an evolutionary scale that exceeds anybody's understanding. What's really happening right now is a social turmoil in which a kind of universal culture in which women are powerful and decision-making partners and able to exercise a different kind of disposition and leadership, and that's going to change our future. What's really happening right now is the advent of exponential progress in technology that's going to create breakthroughs that are going to solve our problems of global warming and even be able to capture and sequester carbon from the atmosphere and turn this into a garden planet. There are so many different narratives that coexist and they're nested. To have a meaningful conversation that isn't narrowing itself down to a piece of all of that is very difficult.
But as you point out in the book, in the micro is the macro. I mean, you can't separate the two. So I want to stay in the political discussion and also bring in that question back again. So let me just add to the conversation as you're pointing out, is I sat with somebody who we both know who is a practitioner, and she said to me that she has thoughts of murder, thoughts of rage because of this particular political landscape that we're now involved with. And that you and I, the question I was bringing to you was that we have to go through a difficult transformation. And I wanted to bring back that question of how do you find something beautiful in Mr. Trump? And you had to consider that.
I think that if we fast forward some number of years into the future, 5, 10, 20, it may very well be that we'll look back on this time as the time when we were able to cohere a meaningful civic engagement, and that Trump was the catalyst for that. Mm-hmm. That his awfulness will prove in retrospect to have been the cause, the grain of sand in the oyster out of which something profoundly beautiful, a pearl beyond price, will have manifested. And I think the sense that so many people have, this is just so wrong, I have to do something about this. Right. How can I make a difference? People are pondering how to make a difference about the environment, how to make a difference about justice, how to make a difference in our racial conversation, how to make a difference on so many fronts that are approaching a critical tipping point. It's the fact that the crisis is upon us, and however lovely life may be in this nice home in San Anselmo, it may not be so nice even here for all that long, depending on our scenarios. And our relatedness to that larger challenge is important, and yet it's so difficult to really get past our denial and our comfort and our spiritual bypassing of it all, and face it without falling into fear and contraction and a loss of fundamental basic trust in being itself, and a disposition that becomes its own self-fulfilling negative prophecy. Mm-hmm. So this challenge that I make to my reader to really look at the darkness directly is contextualized in the book by all my years of spiritual practice and my recognition that we can't fall into that. Most of the people that admit that there is a real possibility of a terrible unraveling tend to gravitate toward a false certainty that it will happen.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know that it will happen. We are creating the future right now.
You bring it into because there's a new conversation. There's something that transcends this fight against evil, good, bad, whatever the word.
Well, I try to take it out of what's happening, and let's pretend that we're objective observers and we're analyzing, and there's this point and there's that point, and let's understand it better.
Right.
Which, in my opinion, is just BS. Because we're not objective, we're not immune. This is you have some grandchildren, you care about this future. We're invested. The meaning of your work, the meaning of this video, the meaning of my book, it all depends upon other people and a world in which this depth of spiritual and cultural and intellectual and technological sophistication that we've been able to summon, has some survival. The idea that that is threatens the meaning of our lives. And so we have to drop down into a heartfelt place where it's like, wow, how do you feel? Where are you at in the midst of this? What does that mean to you? What are you doing now? What are the questions you're asking? And instead of us trying to know it and pin it down, we sit in the question together. If we can sit in the question and deepen into the question and not know, like a koan, a rich, profound question that changes us by our abiding in it. That's the conversation.
And you talk about the unreasonable happiness that we'll get to later, but I'm going back to this point of that. I'm going to term it, as you do, I think, in the book, called collective subjectivism. You bring in the pronoun to the forefront, and the pronoun is we, or collective, connectedness, a unifying principle.
Collective practice.
Practice. And so maybe we could talk to the practice that you're referencing and calling people to.
I hope that people will take away from the book not so much prescriptions at all, but clarifying distinctions and honest confrontations with what, the elephant in the room. And there are multiple pieces to that elephant. All its parts are hidden in different ways. I think that I help people then to see and be with their responsibility, because we each have a responsibility. My grandchildren, your grandchildren, depend on how the other behaves. We're co-creating a future, and therefore we're in this together. And the deep, deep way that we're in this together contradicts the normal terms of discourse. You have your life, make sure you've got it handled. I've got my life, make sure I've got it handled. On the basis of that foundation, we have a conversation across those independent worlds of identity.
The garden fences that you talk about?
Yeah, that's right.
So, here, because this kind of my world, your world, is always has been, right? The duality of the conversation.
Yeah.
But and I want to make reference to this garden fence, which I think is critical to changing the landscape of the dialogue, because the dialogue stays in the left brain, right brain, yours, mine, this back and forth. But
there are multiple independent conversations that do not intersect. Right now, all of us together are existentially challenged, threatened even, and given opportunities. And we're not really talking in a deep and meaningful way with all of our intelligence to one another. And this book helps us to see some of the vital conversations that are not intersecting and calls people to a practitioner's relationship to that challenge.
But you're also talking to a developmental evolutionary leap where this new conversation has to be unfolding, and you can't go from knowing.
Right.
You have to go from not knowing.
That's right.
And there's a trust in all of this.
It's a revolutionary book. I'm
Yeah,
calling
without
people
a
to
doubt.
be
It's pointing to
revolutionaries.
Absolutely.
But I'm also pointing out that the revolution is already underway, that it's inherent in being, that it's already arising, that many of the people who are even going to be interested in this book are already people who can teach me to be a better revolutionary in their area of special expertise, that something is organically already unfolding, and there's a quickening call that's taking it around a corner in a way that hardly anybody is fully grokking. And I think this book can catalyze a deeper awareness and a more mature and more humble and more available disposition in which we can engage authentic conversations that can create a different kind of future.
I want to address a younger question in here from an old man, is that there's a radical element of activism going on today.
Yes.
Right? And so when conservative speakers cannot speak at Berkeley, and Sarah Lawrence has a professor who is injured in a conversation because she wants to bring somebody from Breitbart News to the conversation, could you address some of these activist principles that you bring up here, which is essential to the conversation, because it's just not a conversation, it's an activism that has to be brought into it.
It is.
How do you talk to the person who wants to set fire to the establishment, as we called it back in the 60s?
Well, I call them to set fire to the establishment with their heart. I call them to grow up. I call them to become whole and become a presence of wholeness. And I call them to a revolution that has to enact love and wholeness rather than more fragmentation and opposition. I call them to become practitioners. I don't call them not to be revolutionaries. I call them to be effective, mature revolutionaries who bring something worth bringing into being forward.
Right.
That is my response. Now, how I would do that skillfully with any given individual is I don't know. I would have to see that person.
And so why this, although we can always side with the light and the love aspects of it, there's a dominant liberal rising, as we saw it in the 60s, of SDS and the bombings and the fighting of this kind of tension of the duality.
Well, I do caution that. I think there's a foolishness on the left that doesn't fully account for the fact that people at lower levels of development and who are more vital characters and who are more anger focused, who are already stockpiling guns, who are already resorting to violence and a disposition of opposition, are not in their corner. And we try to have this populist violent uprising from the left, and it's going to be crushed. We're going to have ourselves in a police state with fascists in charge. So I help them ground themselves in reality a little bit. And I think that is the core idea, in a way, is that our cultural and social history, the evolution of human beings across the last 500 years, is a self-accelerating dynamic that is self-complexifying, and that complexity and that speed of change and that speed of relational exchanges and that speed of resource extraction and that speed of financial transactions and all the rest of it is a mad dance of death. It is unsustainable. Things can't go faster and faster and faster forever. You get faster and faster and faster, and that implies a time singularity. In the words of a physicist I quote named Jeffrey West, who wrote an important book.
But we're going to have to get to 186,000 miles per second, and we're heading in that way. But
but we can't do it. The body minds can't handle it.
Right.
The relationships can't handle it. The social structures can't
Or
handle it.
even the information overload,
The
future shock.
The stress dynamics are tripping us up. So we're going faster and faster and faster, and we're beginning to fall apart. So the crucial opportunity of our time, that is fragmentation. That self-accelerating process is a process that self-fragments, and we come apart. Even in our marriages, we come apart, even in our psyches, but certainly in our families, in our organizations, in our communities. There's a loss of just ordinary, healthy coherence. Mm-hmm. So the most positively revolutionary thing that we can do in a time of such fragmentation is to embrace our own health and wholeness, to embody our health and wholeness, and to be a force of health and wholeness that rises like an immune response to an illness. I think that it is inherent in being that wholeness resurges in response to the challenge of this fragmentation. And that is something that you see. All kinds of good work among activists and among many spiritual practitioners. But there's way too many spiritual practitioners who don't get that the outer work and the inner work are inseparable. And there's too many activists who aren't serious enough about their own inner work. They don't get it either.
Right.
So this book is one of the ways that you could catch a piece of what's essential to it, although missing other pieces, would be to say that it's a book about this inextricable inner and outer work. Because it's a conversation with my reader, not about externally focused strategies, but about the inner work that gives us the basis for a rich array of outer strategies. I talk about in the system activism, against the system activism, and around the system activism. And going around the system is enormously creative. You can do that in a lot of different ways. So there's a rich conversation about that. That's what I call evolutionary activism. And that conversation is necessary for spiritual practitioners. Practitioners are making a difference in a variety of ways. You're making a difference as an educator through creating the Beezone. And you're helping deepen people's relationship to existence through that. You're helping to stimulate vertical growth. Another way of talking about what this book is about, it's about a stage transition for humanity and for every nation and for every social group and every person, but also every organization, everything. There's a stage transition that pervades the human condition that is necessary now. Ken Wilber would call it a transition to an integral stage of consciousness. Derrida would talk about it, and I like this, as the beginnings of a transition to the fourth stage of life. The fourth stage of life is a high spiritual realization that an individual can really only find their way to through a committed life of practice sustained over decades. But an alignment with the disposition of the fourth stage of life is possible long before you're a fully realized fourth stage saint. And I think that is possible. And I feel that description is actually more adequate than any of the other stage models, because it points to the primacy of the heart and the intelligence of the heart, which I emphasize. It's in the title of the book.
Well, you call this the ground or the source. So you have to always come from that source position to work through these stages, as you're calling them. Otherwise, you're on top of it instead of coming from it.
Which is the way we can relate to this larger dilemma. We can, the whole game of pointing blame and yes, there are all kinds of negative things about capitalism, and I resonate with a certain amount of Naomi Klein's critique from This Changes Everything and her most recent book. But that oversimplifies things. It isn't just that. Mm-hmm. So the work to be the presence of what is possible now, requires us to appreciate these valuable social and political and economic critiques and learn from them and incorporate their wisdom, but to stand in a relationship to all our knowledge that has a certain amount of, I use this term a lot in the book, it's a $5 word, but epistemic humility. Epistemology is how we know things, ontology is what is real, and epistemology is how you know it. So epistemic has to do with your knowing. And epistemic humility is this deep, installed understanding that whatever we know is provisional, and we're going to learn more. And therefore, we're curious to learn. And we do have to sort out ridiculous, diluted, hogwash perspectives and reject them. But most of the skepticism and rejection of BS takes the stand of, I know what is real. And this humility shifts things. If you have a basic epistemic humility, then you're curious. You're meeting me in your curiosity and my curiosity. The two of us can discover all kinds of new possibilities. That's the kind of conversation that needs to take place. Because it's not like we have somebody here who has all the answers.
So I want to put in a little devil's advocate here in the sense of, I'm reminded that Adida, in his conversations and his work with Not To His Peace, right, which is in line with a lot with what your conversation.
Very much.
Very much so. And I don't want people to confuse what Terry is saying or with anything that Adida says that I'm about to reference. Is that there's a confusion with utopian thought.
Mm-hmm.
There's a confusion between, okay, let's just make everything beautiful. And one of the things that Adida points out is that utopia is not on the cards. Right? And it's about transcendence as the primary motivation to Buddha's threefold take on the world of sickness, old age, and death. So maybe you could just bring in that part that is you're bringing. This is not a utopian message that you're bringing here.
It isn't. It has some sympathy with utopianism in some ways, though. And Adida is, my guru. He is the one who revealed God and the nature and structure of reality to me, and I'm always reverential in relation to that primary spiritual source, which continues to be a blessing. But and I know that the guru model has all kinds of complications, and there's all kinds of reasons why people are on the warpath about that, and I actually respect that motive a lot. And I certainly am not, and will never be a guru. That's not my function. But I do think that transcendence, simply understood, becomes an orientation of spiritual bypassing. And it needs to go beyond that. So although when he advocates for transcendence, he's saying something that is ultimately quite profoundly true. It's a transcendence, like in Wilber's language, that also includes. He always talks about transcend and include. So yes, there needs to be transcendence. Transcendence is ultimately the point. But going from where we are directly to transcendence is a shortcut and a cop-out. Our human existence matters. If we love anything, anyone other than ourselves, if we love a place, if we love anything, we have to caringly engage with the world, and we have to make it as better as we can. And if we are in a time of dramatic good and dramatic bad, we have to go for the dramatic good. We need some dramatic goods to be the disruptors that create our future. So some utopianism is actually healthy and necessary And in the end, it's just going to give us a world of stuff with contradiction and compromise, as he's pointing out. And we're going to ultimately have to have a free relationship to everything frustrating about that better world we might be able to bring into being. But we better bring it into being.
Yeah, well, he says, you can't, as Negro Baba says, if you want to give God to a hungry person, you give him bread, right? So, in terms of the adaptation or transcendence, which is many times, as you're referring to, a bypassing to responsibility, Adida's premise is that you can't transcend what you have not already adapted to. So, just to clarify, Adida's position is that you can't just take transcendence, and a lot of people use Adida and many other teachers to bypass life's responsibilities. He, and as you do, and Wilbur, as you pointed out too, as the transcendence as an inclusive principle, not an exclusive principle, right? And so, you know, it is adapting, and some people want to bypass responsibility. But there is still old age, there's still sickness, there's death, and that's in the cards. And so that's just part of this conditional and also cosmology of where we all are flying through, as Bucky used to say, Buckminster Fuller. We're on a spaceship here, and although it looks like we're solid and safe and floating on water, we're sailing through this universe, and we better wake up.
Yeah,
Right.
that's it. We're all on a lifeboat together, and some of us are mad and vicious and destructive, and we are beginning to damage that raft that we're floating on, to the point that we could all drown, so to speak. And
In our own consumption, in our own desires, in our own
comforts.
that we'll suffocate ourselves with.
And we have another choice. And that choice arrives with every breath. Practice begins with every breath. It goes on forever, but it begins with every new breath. And that recognition that practitioners have is going to be essential to full citizenship, really, in the world that...
The human world.
Yes.
Not this animal world that seems to be just out here for desires and consumption. And,
Truly human.
right, truly human. Where that heart, that fourth stage that you're referring to, is awakened.
Exactly.
And lived.
And that's a new republic of the heart. That's what
Say
I'm
that
referring
just
to.
cost.
Yeah, that's a new republic of the heart.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about.
Well, I want to thank you very much, and for our listeners, I want to thank you for staying with us during this conversation. And if you would like to continue the conversation in a more depthful way, wait until March 6th, I believe. Is that true?
That's right.
March 6th, and Amazon, I believe, is one way in which you can get it. There's terrypatten.com, and anything?
You don't have to wait till March 6th.
Ah.
If you're an Amazonian, you can pre-order it there, but you can pre-order it from your local bookstore or from Barnes and Noble or all kinds of other sources, and I hope you will.
Oh, good. Well, I want you to stay in conversation with the Beezone, because I hope I grab this guy another time while I'm here again. So thank you very much for staying tuned, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we'll see you again soon, I hope. Take care.
Thanks, Ed.